The terror attack has raised questions again of how the UK can neutralise the threat posed by a group like ISIS, one that works through a complex franchise-style structure that seeks to radicalise and train recruits via the internet and then claim ownership of any attacks that follow. It's a strategy that poses a major challenge to security forces. So how can ISIS's radical theology and its ability to strike here be limited without alienating a whole generation of young Muslims? Here to speak to us now is the military analyst Tom Clonan and Dr Chris Allen, a lecturer on social policy at Birmingham University. Well, first of all, Tom Clonan, just from your experience of this, it's pretty clear that this is a network, isn't it? It's not one individual.
In the case of the Manchester attack, it appears obviously now to have been a cell-type structure or a networked attack. If you look back at the spate of attacks we've had, Westminster Bridge, the Stockholm truck attack, the Berlin market attack, the Nice truck attack, very often you've got this mutating hybrid type of attacks. On the one hand, you have these impromptu opportunistic type attacks where you get an angry man, like for example in the case of the Tunisian attacker in Nice and Promenade des Anglais. You know, he was at the end of a legal separation process with his wife. He gets a truck and drives it and kills over 80 innocent men, women and children. You move on to look at the Westminster Bridge attack again, an isolated individual who carries out an attack in this impromptu fashion and then, you know, invokes the rhetoric of Islamic State to give it some sort of legitimacy or authority. So that's one type of attack we had, and very often many of those attacks, and I don't like to use this word in this context, but they tend to be unsuccessful or botched. They're not really mass casualty incidents a la mode Islamic State, what they'd really like. And then on the other hand, you have this targeted individual, Salim Abedi, who was obviously groomed for an attack and supported by a cell structure. So it's complex, and it makes it very, very difficult for the security services to combat it. But I would say this, all of these attacks, whether they're opportunistic hate crimes wrapped in the rhetoric of Islamic State or networked ones, they're all designed to drive a wedge or, to create hostility and suspicion between different ethnic groups in order to, again, to give some sort of legitimacy to the twisted logic of Islamic State's, rhetoric. So we have to be really careful in all of this that we reach out to our Muslim brothers and sisters because as your previous contributor said, the solution to this lies within the mosques, the madrasas, the schools, and with our community leaders and our own politicians. That's where the solution for this ultimately lies.
Oh, Chris Allen, what do you make of that? Ben Wallace, the security minister, government security minister, said yesterday on the BBC that they think there are something like 12 to 18,000 people in the same category as Salman Abedi. In other words, people have been brought to the attention of the authorities, but not as imminently about to do something. That's, I know, still a minority of young Muslim men, but it's not exactly a few bad apples, is it?
No, but I think that really the issue here is the way in which we've tried to approach this. And when you're talking about that 12 to 18,000 individuals that has some sort of potential, I think really what you're doing there is you're looking at probably data and numbers which have come from intelligence work. What we're seeing, though, is that there's been a huge emphasis onto the PREVENT programme. And, as was being explained previously, very articulately put, on one end of the scale you have these, like the Salman Abdi sort of atrocities from Monday, which has, planning and preparation and execution, which is clearly, taking much time. And on the other end of the scale, you have the Khalid Mahmood and Westminster, which is, this kind of impromptu, opportunistic. And what you have is a government programme which actually lumps all of this together and everything in the middle and seeks to try and, counter radicalisation in this way. And what this does is it actually seeks to kind of intervene in this kind of pre-criminal space to try and identify those who may or may not, be vulnerable to something that we don't really know what they may or may not be vulnerable to. and then we hope that we try and stop them from actually, going on, whether they do or not, to do something, commit some sort of atrocity. And actually, where the real emphasis should be in this is in terms of that, 12 to 18,000 people that actually are being highlighted by the intelligence services. And I think that one of the things we've seen is this great emphasis on kind of, trying to look at, notions of ungoverned spaces, statutory duties, we're looking at this kind of, non-violent extremism, looking at, is an Orthodox Muslim family, are they on a conveyor belt that actually going to become radicalised at some time in the future? And really where we should be looking at is really investing this money into policing. And as has been said, on a number of the previous guests, is that actually it's within communities. And if we look at the kind of policing, that community policing, since 2010, 1 in 7 police officers has been axed. So that ability to be able to outreach into those communities.
Just to be clear, are you saying that basically these 12 to 18,000 that Ben Wallace mentioned are unlikely to be particularly receptive to any government prevention campaigns, and that money would be better spent basically keeping tabs on them?
Yeah, if we look at, if we take, for example, Salman Abdi and Khalid Massoud, two completely different types of, sort of atrocities which have been committed, would they have been picked up by the government Prevent programme? I really don't think they would have done. And what we're seeing is we're seeing millions of pounds invested into this kind of Prevent programme, and for me, it's really not working. What it's doing is it's casting this kind of lens of suspicion over all Muslims, saying that we need to be looking at those Muslim communities and we need to be kind of focusing down and trying to see where the problems are. And yet actually the intelligence services already have these kind of individuals on their radar, and so it seems to me it's a kind of very blunt instrument to try and actually sort of try and identify who these individuals are, when actually the intelligence services already have a good idea, or at least are being able to narrow down these individuals.
Okay, Tom, I'm curious as to whether you agree with that these prevention programs are largely a waste of time, and that we need to do things differently.
Well, I think they're focusing somewhat on the symptoms of the central problem. If I could just put some context on this, in Ireland, our Muslim population has increased by 50% since 2006, and if you like, the identity issues that Irish Muslims have are not as rehearsed or as evolved, perhaps, as they are in Britain. And we don't have the phenomenon of Islamophobia as yet in any great way. So Irish Muslims report feeling quite well integrated. Their own sense of identity is still in negotiation. And yet we have the same level of radicalisation as you do in Britain. And, the Centre for Studies for International Radicalisation at King's College, our own police and intelligence services have identified that,
how interesting. What conclusion do you draw from that?
Well, the conclusion I draw from it is you have to look at, you've got to go back to first causes. If you look at Islamic State, they're believed to have funding of up to 1.5 billion. Compare that to Hezbollah, who've been around for decades. They've only ever had about a couple of 100 million. FARC, the narco-terrorists in Latin America, 80 to 350 million estimates. So Islamic State, who appeared almost out of nowhere, have huge funding. So we have to figure out who's backing them. And I suspect that, answer can be found in the Gulf states. So I won't name them, but they've had some very high-profile visitors of late. And they're reaching out and grooming. They're the ones that are creating havoc. I see lots of parallels with the Provisional IRA, the major threat that we had. The Provisional IRA had a policy known as the Lily Whites Programme, where they targeted young men and women with no criminal or intelligence profile and got them to carry out horrific bomb attacks in the UK. Does that sound familiar? We also had then the die-hard ideologues, in Northern Ireland. And that was often characterised as a religious conflict, particularly in the United States, Catholic versus Protestant. But really, when you drill down into it, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness weren't fighting over the virgin birth. They weren't fighting over issues of doctrine or religious ideology. All of these conflicts inherently are political at their basis. So what we need to do is participate in a broader international effort to find out why we have this radicalisation. Right. But in terms of the threat at home, and there are going to be more attacks this summer as Raqqa and Mosul are closed down, the Caliphate closes, we will have more attacks. And the name of the game now is reacting. How do you close down an attack quickly, and how do you deal with the injured on site? And unfortunately, that's the game we're in at the moment.
Okay, briefly, Chris, we're running out of time, but
Sorry.
do you think there is an increased danger if both Mosul and Raqqa fall over the next few months, that ISIS will increasingly turn its attention to attacks in the West?
I think that we're constantly sort of need to be aware that actually sort of the influences from the Middle East, but also from the extremists that are already here in our own society, in our own country, are always going to be looking to kind of find some way of justifying their grievances, and then kind of justifying the commitment of terrible atrocities. And I think that we need to be aware of that. But it's just about how we actually respond to this and how we begin to deal with this. And I think that really for me it's about this issue of belonging and isolation and exclusion. The vast majority of Muslims in this country, feel very British, living their life exactly the same as the rest of us. And I think that really what it's about is actually how do we begin to try and stop those messages that come from ISIS, from the Middle East, from those extremist groups. How do we try and bring those who already feel as though they don't belong here to actually come back in and actually feel as though they have a stake in society?
All right, Luke, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us